Thanks everyone for being here today, and we're here to celebrate Hallowtown, Oakland Century Development and Construction by Mr. Schwarzer. So it's really exciting for people here and for people virtually to be able to hear from our panelists that are going to be here talking. So you've made it to the Regional and Urban Design Board. You're here at the Regional and Urban Design Forum. We do a monthly program the first Thursday of each month. And this is just one of our cool programs, except we have a special collaboration with the Oakland Chamber of Commerce. We're really excited about having them here.
Woo, Oakland Chamber!
We're here in Oakland for 100 years, and we're really excited about having this collaboration and seeing how this can continue to develop. I know that the Chamber of Commerce was definitely mentioned a lot more in this book than AIE Stay. I think that we all have a common goal of trying to make a great city for our residents, our retail tenants, our commercial tenants, and also.
So I am Brian Isaac. I'm the president of the AIE Stay and also the co-chair of this Regional and Urban Design Forum. Jay Castle, who's in the room here, is also a co-chair, and Tyler Kovic, who I think is virtually with you guys, is also a co-chair. So we welcome all of you to here. We have a couple of events we want to announce that are upcoming. We as a chapter go from Napa down to Fremont. So we are doing home tours this year in Napa. Very excited about that. We have about 4 homes confirmed now. And if anyone wants to be a docent for that, please reach out to Mike at theaestay.org and keep your eyes out on the emails about joining the home tours and seeing these homes. Also, Spur has an event coming up on August 18th called How Bay Area Cities Are Guiding the Regional Housing Growth. So there's going to be representatives from the City of Oakland, City of San Jose, and City of San Francisco talking about how we're all doing with this our housing. And lastly, Banff in Berkeley is having a free outdoor movie series. I think there's 4 or 5 movies going on. But what's really interesting about this is we have been based here, AIE has been based here in Oakland for over 20 years, and now we've moved to downtown Berkeley. So Banff is going to be 2 blocks away from our new office at the Brower Center. So come check us out, say hi to us, and then also see a movie. Next. So tonight, we have 3 guests joining. Here. He's in the. Thank you for being here, and I really appreciated how you kind of gave us a guideline or the history of Oakland and allowed us to understand how we got to where we are and how we created a city that is an immensely diverse population and a wonderful place to be. We have the mayor. I've never introduced the mayor, so thank you for coming. A lot of people call you Libby. I'll call you Mayor Schaaf for now. I've heard one of her staff members call her the mayor of the streets, and I think this is appropriate. Is that she started the first transportation department in Oakland, and we're all seeing the improvements in the streets from potholes to bikeways to green streets. She also drives around a snail car from time to time, which is pretty great. The Flow Streets was an amazing thing during the pandemic and a really great experiment that I keep figuring out how to build and make even better. And then, ultimately, you're in the neighborhoods. You're starting programs. You're engaging with all the neighborhoods of Oakland, and I think that's really the important part. Really reaching out to people of Oakland. I think you're doing a great job. I asked my 15-year-old daughter what she would like to say to the mayor, what questions she has for the mayor, and she said that she wants to know if she has any chores for you for her to work on. And I was thinking about it, and I think she really meant for you to come and do yard work in your house. But we've been a AIA has been a really forum. We've been here 3 head designing and building a city of Oakland. I think your title goes longer than that, but
So that's about right.
about right. Been here since 2018, and what I really appreciate about what I've heard from you is it's like your experience working in Birmingham and New Orleans, and just really engaging community as a way to come up with design solutions that make great spaces. So, we're happy to have you back, and thank you for being here. So tonight's presentation, next slide, Mike, will consist of an intro by the mayor, and then Mitchell will be doing a 20-minute presentation about whatever you want to do it about. So he'll tell you that. And then there'll be a moderated discussion between Bill and Mitchell, and finally some Q&A. We really want to engage people in this room, but also don't want to lose people virtually. So please put questions in the chat, and we'll try to address them in the Q&A. And for people that are here, we'll do a little book signing with Mitchell and close it out. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and turn over to you.
Piece of trash a day. If she really wasn't, she should sign up to adopt a spot. Because, you know, we are in this moment coming out of this pandemic where I think people are cutting from. And yet, I think what we know about our hella town is that we are a very feisty and resilient place. And one gift that I've had as the mayor and as a lifetime Oaklander is really understanding the importance of place, of the built and physical environment, and how it is not just a dead, static thing, but it can create community. It can change how we feel about different people, how we mix with people that may be different from us or come from other places, how we honor and celebrate different cultures in our environment. I know Bill is going to end up telling the story of how we met. Kind of sounds like a first date.
Yes.
It was like a professional first date.
Yes.
There is an institute, Mayor's Institute for City Design. And it was such a phenomenal experience for me. And Bill was there as an expert from New Orleans. But I think we always knew that our destinies were somehow interwoven. In fact, he gave me a tour of LA Skid Row in his pickup truck. I missed the original tour. There is potential magic in the physical space. And also, if we don't know the history of how our physical space got to where it is, we will not correct the mistakes of the past. And I really want to thank Mitchell for telling an honest history. I think in Oakland, we're very hella proud of ourselves that we have this great legacy of being change makers, of being warriors for social justice. But it has not always been that way. That we too have a very troublesome legacy and history. And there is hope that we can change the physical environment to also heal, correct, and create an amazing future of our own making. I want to also celebrate this marriage of the AIA. And I happen to know that this marriage has been very fruitful. Produced two beautiful children. Oh, I'm talking about Barb and Mike. I think it actually is wonderful that this is a city, that is a town. The fact that you two are married to each other, and there are lots of other fun facts we could go into as far as history. But
I'm gonna mute this.
but that's part of Oakland's magic. And that we have a choice, and the built environment and the city planning and policies like zoning actually either create a city that can be cold and unwelcoming and separating, or can create a town, a place that is warm and inviting, where neighbors know one another, where we help out people, whether we've met them before or not. And so, Mitchell, I loved your book. It was an honor to get an advance copy of it, get to write a little blurb. And I love how you have told the journey, the history, but also given us an inspiration and blueprint for the future of a hella town. So thank you for joining us tonight. Hey, Justin. I have events are back, so like I'm getting dragged to all sorts of things. So if I can stay, I will. If I can't, it's not because I don't.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Brian, and getting this together. I know we tried. Can you all hear me? I'm under where I'm now. So, many ways to cut into the book, and I thought that I've been giving talks around the area, and I try to find out new ways. And so this is a new way. Okay, and I'm going to talk about satellite cities, and Oakland as a satellite city, and I'll try to define what that is. Okay, so I'm going to talk about satellite cities when Oakland began, which was really San Francisco, Oakland, Alameda, Berkeley. That's really the core of the Bay Area. Those four cities had about 70% of California's population. This is really the different era. And I'll talk, Oakland, obviously, after 1869 and the Transcontinental Railroad, and after 1906, really starts to become not just a little village, right? But really a large American city, a mid-sized American city. And really competed with San Francisco in a way that was really intense and really dominated, I think, Oakland's existence all the way up to the end of the century. For almost 100 years, Oakland was trying to measure up to San Francisco. Best San Francisco be bigger, maybe? Really, I think there was a lot of thought that Oakland could actually become the center city, the core city of the Bay Area. It worked occasionally, I'll talk about it, but often it didn't work. And since then, really, I think for the last 20 years, since Jerry Brown, and certainly since William Schaaf's era, I think there's more of an emphasis on making Oakland, Oakland, and saying, we're not going to try to best San Francisco. We really can't do that. That doesn't make sense. Really, what makes Oakland wonderful is Oakland and the proximity to San Francisco and Berkeley and all that. So it's a different mentality. I think it's a more realistic and fruitful mentality for going forward. Okay. And here's just I should have brought my little pointer. Here's a shot of what it looked like around just before 1900. So you get a sense of where you have a lot of cross hatchings. There's more urbanization, right? Look at the peninsula. West Oakland, Alameda, and San Francisco. That's the core. And really what's our city, all cities around the world, really, is that the early part of a city's history is really a battle between different areas. Who's going to become the core city? And almost most of the time, one city becomes largest. Sometimes Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, it's a little iffy, right? No one really became, well, maybe Raleigh's the largest, but in most cases, you get a London or a Paris or New York, right? That kind of dominates. I mean, more or less. And you got San Francisco. We'll talk about it at the end. Now we're really a three center, right? We have us as a San Francisco. Next, please. What are satellite cities? They're called a lot of things: second cities, secondary cities, second order cities, emerging cities. All sorts of different words to describe what are the other cities that are next to a very large city. One model, these are three typologies, three types of satellite cities. One is a string of much smaller cities that surround the major city. I lived in Chicago, out there for a while. You know Chicago, Gary, Joliet, Aurora, Elgin, and Waukegan. It's like this ring necklace. About 35 miles, 40 miles from the loop, from the center of Chicago, this whole range of cities, much smaller, but they function as satellite cities. Joliet at one time thought they could become the biggest city, but that didn't happen. Boston has something similar. You know, I lived there. Brockton, Worcester, the Merrimack Valley Hill towns like Lowell and Lawrence and Lynn. A whole row of cities around Boston. Again, about 30 miles or so from the center. So that's one model. Another model is an interesting one where the original core city is overtaken over time by an upstart. And that's the case with St. Paul and Minneapolis. St. Paul was really the center. It was the large city, and Minneapolis overtook it because of the falls and because of the mill industry, the grain economy. Similarly with Fort Worth and Dallas, right? Fort Worth originally was the larger city. It had the fort, it had the stockyards, but then Dallas developed the kind of financial retail economy, et cetera. It became the largest. Although these two examples, the cities are very close in size. You know, it's not a 2 to 1 even. It's like a 3 to 2 in terms of population. In this case, this is like a 10, 15 to 1. This is close. And then you have our case, where Oakland and San Francisco fall in. And other examples are Newark, New York, Long Beach, and Los Angeles. And there are other examples where you have maybe Seattle and Tacoma, which fit in with that as well, where you have eventually a large core city and an upstart gets almost as big, but never really gets big close enough. And Oakland has pretty much been about half the size of San Francisco historically. In terms of population, in terms of business economy, a bit smaller, right? I'll just show you examples. So this is a view from Gary to Chicago. So you see the enormous Chicago. Gary actually has St. Paul and Minneapolis, very close in size. As you can see in terms of population, about 14 miles apart, although they actually join. They're actually physically contiguous parts. You can walk from one to the other. This is a shot from Newark of Lower Manhattan. And it's about the same, a little bit further than Oakland is to San Francisco, not that different. Although Newark is much smaller. We're talking about 8.8 million people. Newark has gone down in population. So it's a more dramatic difference. And then finally, Oakland and San Francisco. It's a nice shot showing the two together. About 12 miles apart, about half the population, and in very close proximity with each other. And I would say for all of the satellite cities, the core city's existence really determines a lot of what the satellite city has to contend. Its vision, its opportunities, its strivings, as well as the things it doesn't achieve. Examples. Culture, right? Part of being a satellite city is having less cultural venues because the core city dominates them. And this was certainly the case, has been the case here. So in Oakland, we have the Oakland Museum, wonderful 1969 amalgamation of 3 really tiny museums, really small. One was the Carson mansion right by the lake. The others, one was in the Memorial Auditorium building, quarter. That was the art. 2 rooms in a quarter of the Memorial Auditorium. And then the Chabot Space and Science. Probably these are probably 2 of Oakland's largest cultural organization museums. But San Francisco, of course, the Palace, the Legion of Honor, the De Young, Cal Academy, the Exploratorium, SF MoMA, the Agent. It has the predominance of the cultural world because it started earlier and the philanthropy was more active there. So it has that domination. As well as in performing arts, right? San Francisco, here's Davies next to the world, the Opera House. This is really the only major performing arts building that wasn't built for such, right? It was built as a cinema, movie theater. It was abandoned for a number of years, like the Fox, and then it was redone the symphony used to play at the Royal Auditorium, what's now the Calvin Simmons Theater. And because of the Oakland Museum and the sports complex out by, 66th Avenue, I think the Oakland the civic leaders thought, oh, we need a new concert hall. We need a new, for the Oakland Symphony. And they actually retrofitted the Paramount to function as a place for the ballet and the symphony. And it had a mixed history, to be honest. And it's described in the book. Symphony didn't really have the kind of, glittering years were earlier, actually. And Zellebach heard, there's no question. Zellebach was built on the Berkeley campus, and it became a premier concert venue. And that's another example of how Oakland, and this is the up and down, right? On the one hand, Berkeley has a lot of cultural organizations, as does San Francisco. Oakland suffers in some ways, but if you live in Oakland, you can go to Berkeley or San Francisco quite easily. So we have the benefit of those. And so this is the kind of push and pull of a city like Oakland between two. Berkeley, for its size, is really a cultural powerhouse, 100,000 people, but a lot of, because of the University of California, right? Next, please. This is Jacqueline Square. I wrote an article about Jacqueline Square. If you're interested, it's mentioned in the book. It's a kind of sad story because Jacqueline Square was modeled on Fisherman's Wharf. And Fisherman's Wharf grew up organically. Jacqueline Square also grew up organically, but then over time, Jacqueline Square kept trying to measure up to Fisherman's Wharf. It kept not measuring up. So for instance, when Fisherman's Wharf put up, when they renovated the cannery in Ghirardelli Square, 2 factory warehouse buildings, and then they became retail complexes, very successful, right? We put up Jacqueline Village, which was a 2-acre intentional kind of model on Ghirardelli Square. And it was nice. I remember going there a number of times. It was a sweet place, and they tore it down. They tore it down in 1987. Why? Well, in the middle 1980s. Why? Because San Francisco had put up Pier 39. And Oakland was like, oh my God, it's doing so well. So they came up with a plan called Jacqueline's Waterfront in 87. There was going to be a regional mall. Now, this is just a few years before Eastmont Mall closed. Oakland's one regional mall, over on 66, where the old General Motors was. And they thought we could have a regional mall here with bad freeway access and a lot of not free parking, a lot of things that are going to do any regional mall. Total failure, right? Nothing happens. None of the stores, the Gap, Victoria's Secret, all those stores were supposed to come to Oakland. None of them came. And then finally, in the 2009, so it keeps happening. San Francisco did the Ferry Building in the early 2000s, right? Converted, the former transit hub into a gourmet marketplace with a Saturday farmers market, et cetera. Again, glittering success. Oakland, we can do that. We can do it twice as big. We're going to do Jacqueline's Harvest Hall. And I'm sure, if you know where there's a little row of restaurants, Forge and a couple others, and then there's this big building, and the ground floor and the second floor are empty. That's what would have been. Never happened. Again, the Great Recession hurt. It opened right at the time of the Great Recession. But Jacqueline, this is a great example of trying to compete and not being able to. Because Oakland, frankly, is not a tourist destination the way San Francisco is. You're competing against the most, probably, maybe other than New Orleans and New York City, the premier tourist destination in the country. And this was our time to. Next week. The saddest thing I feel with the competition, I wish this competition that works. It didn't. What San Francisco put up in the 1860s, Golden Gate Park, it's an unbelievable achievement because this really was a not very inspiring place. We talk about the fog today coming in, right? It used to be the sand. The sand would waft in like the fog. Much worse, right? Your house gets covered in sand, right? So, and this whole part of San Francisco is called the Wasteland. No one ever thought, here's the sunset and the Richmond. No one thought that developers like, people aren't going to want to live out there. It's like this windswept wasteland. The park changed everything. they actually put in trees to stabilize the soil, to block the sand, and created this incredibly verdant, large park, 1,400 acres, 600 acres larger than Central in San Francisco. We had a plan too. The plan was to build a great park up here, called Wildwood Park. It would have gone from the lake up through Trestle Glen, up through the canyon, Diamond Canyon, all the way up to the high redwoods. You'd have been able to walk from sea level to over 1,000 feet in one park. It was magisterial. It was in the early 20th century. And a crummy mayor, but you guys had crummy mayors. And I think he was the crummiest, Mayor John Davey. John Davey was like, I don't want public money for anything but, helping my developer grant. It was really that kind of situation. He blocked the park because he was the longest standing Oakland mayor in history. He had 4+ terms as mayors. And so this is what we got downtown. This was Frank Mott, a little bit earlier. That's Lakeside Park, right? Lake Merritt. It's wonderful, and the areas around it are wonderful. But as the mayor knows and everyone knows, it gets really crowded because people want it, and it's not nearly big enough. It should be many times bigger. And had we had that park, there would have been a place for flatland people to go. And unfortunately, we have amazing parks, Eastern Regional System, up in the hills, but you have to drive up there, right? And certainly you see the demographics up there are different, right? It's wealthier people, not as many people of color go up there because we don't have a big land park. So I did wish this had happened. I wish that it actually happened. Another one was the airport. This is Oakland Airport from the aerial shot. This is Northfield, this is Southfield. So this is the jet airport that you use now. This is more of a private airport now. This was the largest airport in the Bay Area. And people thought this was really going to be the major airport. San Francisco, there's SFO. In 1950s, early 1950s, bolted ahead. They first went ahead because during the Second World War, Oakland Airport had to turn over to the military. And San Francisco, through political machinations, avoided it. So they were operating all through the Second World War while Oakland was not. And so after the war, they had a huge, before the war, Oakland was ahead. After the war, Oakland was behind. When they created the new landfill 4 runways, they became the premier airport. Even though this was probably a better location in terms of weather, in terms of landing. But all we got was 1 runway. And I think now it's about 5-1 in terms of passengers. They're 5 times larger. By the way, San Jose too has never been able to do that. So these are examples of Oakland competing, not always succeeding.
Question. I have heard that SFO is called SFO because the airport was an O and LAX was an X. Is that wrong?
I don't know that. I mean, we're called Oak. SFO, I always thought San Francisco, but I'm not sure. Sorry. Where we did succeed was in the port in terms of overtake. So Oakland had 2 really big successes vis-a-vis. One is the port. Here's the old San Francisco port. You can see these are called finger piers, and these are sheds for storing the goods. And this is great bulk shipping, where you take lots of individual items individually and store them within the sheds. This is Oakland, Port of Oakland container. This was in the 1960s, really gets going. The first land-based cranes in the world were in the Oakland area, were in the Oakland port, built in Alameda. They're unfortunately in Shanghai. They went to Shanghai, they were sold, and no one knows where they are. Whether the Chinese port authorities melted them, down to steel and did something with them, they would have been really historic. But Ben Nutter, who was the director of the port in the 60s, was really a visionary, and he created, created the 7th Street terminal. This is not the 7th Street terminal, it's leading up to it. And in 1967, we were the 2nd largest container port on Earth, after Rotterdam, which is kind of amazing. that didn't last forever, but we've been a large container port ever since, and pretty soon put San Francisco port out of business. Part of this is Oakland's visionary striving. Part of it also is the fact that they don't have the interstate highways and rail. And it's hard for trucks, there's nowhere for trucks to really pass themselves. It's only in Market area. So Oakland really succeeded there. Another one area, which I think is perhaps, just incredible when you think about it. A city of 400,000 people had at one point in the 60s, 4 major league teams. It had the hockey team, I think they were they the California Seals? California Golden Seals. The stadium was built for the Raiders, new AFL franchise. Then the Oakland A's moved from Kansas City to join the Raiders. And then the arena was built and the Seals played there, and then a team that has achieved a modicum of success for recent years. The Golden played there. The reason, anyone know why they call them Golden State? Because they were going to be shared with San Diego. And somehow they thought there's a Golden Gate Freeway that runs down Southern California. And the 5, we'll call them the Golden State Warriors. So that's how you got it. But really, it's really incredible. This SOM, beautiful design. I think the best designed set of stadiums anywhere. And they had never designed a stadium before. Never done it. And in 1966, they designed both of these. Both of them ruined a bit, right? This is not a photo with Al Davis's wall. That huge thing that he put up when the Raiders came out. And then they put up these strange entrance, not respecting it all, but still an amazing achievement. 4 professional teams for a city of 400,000. It's unheard of. I can't think of another example, even just 3. And so that was a real big success. This is what San Francisco had. The Cow Palace, built in the 1942, instantly outmoded. That's where they played basketball and other things. They tried to build a stadium in Europe, but Wayne didn't. And then Candlestick Park, probably one of the less successful baseball parks, based on its location. And again, the multi-use formula. So San Francisco didn't do as well. Now, of late, we're a little harder for us. They built the Chase Center. They took our Warriors away. They brought them across the bay, but at least they won again. So I had friends who were convinced. I'm a huge fan. I had friends who were convinced they'll never win again now that they got cursed the Chase didn't happen. And then this is the Howard Terminal, right? So you all know what's going on. So that's our last hope for the Oakland Cap 1 team. To build a stadium here, which I strongly support for the Oakland Athletics, so we can keep the athletics and have a baseball team. Of course, there's a tremendous connection between the two, always. Right? This is the Bay Bridge in 1936, 35 actually, under construction, right? Shortly, about 8 months before it opens, right? Connecting the two cities. The connections are very important. Next, please. This is the Oakland Mall. This is basically how you got from the rest of the United States and parts of the East Bay to San Francisco. You took trains, and later you drove, and here are the ferries, and they went to the ferry building. So this was the connection between the two before the Bay Bridge. So the connection is really essential. The connection between the two is essential. Next, please. And of course, when you look at highways and rapid transit, right? Here's Oakland, right? San Francisco. San Francisco, San Francisco. And San Francisco profited tremendously. They built approximately 60 million square feet of office space within 10 years. That's more than Oakland has. By more. Because what people found out, it's not just offices, it's also retail. People out, remember Alameda and Contra Costa County have 3 million people. It's enormous. It's an enormous population. The largest of all the double counties, right? You can park under Oakland. And 15 minutes later, you're in San Francisco, even less. So why not? And that hindered the development of office and retail in Oakland, even though the prognoses at the time where Oakland's going to build, and so I talk about in the book, City Center, the glittering new center, which is, there you see a little bit of it over here, where Oakland leveled 18 blocks of downtown in order to build this gigantic shopping mall. 5 major department stores are going to be part of it, and it's going to be ringed by high-rise office buildings. None of that happened. It's kind of a big failure. 2 office buildings were built in the first 15 years. That's it. And the rest of it was empty. Remember, probably a lot of people remember walking around Oakland in the late 70s all the way into the 90s, right? It was just vacant lot after vacant lot. That kind of competition just didn't really work anymore. But I think that's really what led Mayor Brown, who came into office he was elected in '98, to say, look, no more of this. No more leveling whole parts of Oakland. No more coming up with dreams that Oakland's gonna hit a home run with this one big project. Instead, his plan was we're gonna revitalize downtown piecemeal. Here, there, uptown, Jacqueline Square, Old Oakland, all over. And I think what Mayor Schaaf has done, her plan is, I think it's for 17,000 units. 17. His was 10. Yeah. Both are probably going to succeed. He just about came up with that number. Is just if you can just do basically what I talk about is the Chinatown Hall. If people live downtown, they will shop and recreate downtown, and then others will come because the atmosphere will grow. And I think if not for the Great Recession and the pandemic, we'd probably be seeing right now a more vibrant downtown. You just have to go to San Francisco and see their downtown too is very, and this is the case, unfortunately, around the whole country because of the pandemic. So this kind of I think we changed and we kind of learned. And I'd like to end with, used to be San Francisco was the great competitor, right? But now we know here's what is Silicon Valley, right? People always ask me, centered somewhere in here, but it goes up to Fremont. It really goes out to Dublin, Pleasanton. It takes so much of San Francisco up to perhaps Redwood City or even beyond now, South San Francisco. In a lot of ways, it's kind of moving into Oakland, right? And this is just what it has done, of course, is kind of like the earthquake in 1906. It has caused a huge movement of people and business to the East Bay. And that's really, I think, the dominant factor of what's going on in Oakland now, right? Is that it's on the good side of things, right? We're getting a lot of people, a lot of investment. On the bad side of things, the prices are going way up. And a lot of all-time Oaklanders are priced out. So there's been a lot of displacement. Not direct displacement, because the new buildings are not built, on top, they're not demolishing old existing neighborhoods like they used to in urban rural days, the Acorn Project, for instance, but still the displacement is occurring because there's an overall appreciation. I'm going to end here. I think the question will probably bring up a lot of things.
We're gonna have a little bit of conversation, but I'm gonna try to get us to the Q&A pretty quick. I think that's a lot of good stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. To your point, I have a question about, predictions for post-pandemic. I look at Jacqueline today and I see all the mid-rises and they're full. And a lot of office space vacancy in San Francisco. So do you have any kind of prediction that's more compared to work from home? what they do.
And bear in mind, we're talking with a historian.
No, I know.
That's always nice. So just one more.
You know, it's like one of those, I could predict that. I would be like the guru, right? I think everyone is talking about this, right? There's two things going on, right? At least. One is more than two. One is retail, right? The retail during the pandemic, the migration to online retail accelerated dramatically. Amazon is bigger than ever. And we're wondering, you know, Oakland in a way is not suffering as much because Oakland doesn't have a lot of retail. So, you know, it's a weird thing for San Francisco suffering more, and a lot of places are suffering. So retail is one. Office is the second, right? How many people, what percentage of the workforce will go back to the office? Is it 80? Is it 75? Is it 85? Because it makes a big difference, each small percentage. Because all those small businesses, right, and institutions that rely on the office workers, restaurants, concert halls, et cetera, staying after work, if people are working from home, they're gonna suffer, right? And we see them suffering, right? So I don't think anyone can predict. I think long-term, there's gonna be more at home. There's no question. It's just a question, I think, of what percentage. You know, how dramatic will it be? You know, will it get up to a third? You know, and if it does, and I think if it does, it's gonna hurt the downtowns, the traditional downtowns. Because as you know, for those of you who've been, I'm sure a lot of you have been around the world, American downtown is an anomaly. You know, most historic cores were not replaced almost entirely by office buildings. They maintained a lot of old institutions like churches or mosques or temple complexes, residences, etc. You know, and office areas were built around, but not in the core. We allowed our cores to be completely taken over by offices, commercial downtown, right? I talk about this in chapter 1 of the book. You know, a lot of the key aspects of what was made it American downtown exciting, like downtown Oakland, the movie theater, pretty much gone, right?
Hey, Mitchell,
The departments.
let's get to the QA section. So, because I want to do a sit down and then we'll all get to these kinds of questions.
Okay.
But I want to bring in
Okay.
our moderator here.
Who needs a moderator?
I want us to sit.
We didn't know.
Whatever
you guys are comfortable with.
Understand. Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that. Okay, great. And it strike me, it was fascinating that the focusing talk around the satellite relationship between cities that are in close proximity, and I really enjoyed the various examples of scale that you gave, city A to city B. I'm thinking about New York, that you mentioned, which quite literally was not a city that we know until 1898, and for much of that time, Brooklyn, as a separate city, was always ranked among the top 5 across the nation. So there was an interesting dynamic there that, in some ways, I think mirrored that last slide you had, where you have this really multi-nucleated metropolitan area in ways that you don't really find much in America at all. I mean, you see so many cities of such strong posture as we have in the Bay Area. And the dynamic now that that's thrown, that it's not just Oakland looking in a mirror at San Francisco, but we're really having to think in terms of the region. And that we have so many public agencies and intergovernmental agencies that also require us in some form of fashion to think that way around transportation, environment, and so forth. And the other thing that struck me in terms of the relationship between cities and how one might see itself as a sort of a funhouse mirror distortion of another. It's not often about the proximity in terms of closeness. And the period of time that I was in Birmingham, that city was also constantly measuring itself against Atlanta, a city that was another time zone away, over 200 miles away, and yet half the conversations, at least, about some large civic enterprise, a new dome or transportation center of some type, was always being measured about, well, what's it going to do compared to what Atlanta is doing. So it really is an embedded mindset that often cities take generations or years to break away from in order to sort of find their true self. What's the best path that they have? So that was a fascinating perspective in terms of seeing us in the context first of San Francisco, things that we've done because we might have been egged on.
competitive. But then how we are now adapting to a much broader context of what Oakland can and should be. One thing I wanted to ask, because I don't know what the line of questions are going to go when we open it up. Again, I come at this with three perspectives I want to have some fun with you on, if I may. One is certainly coming out of the South, coming from New Orleans, having spent time in Birmingham. And one of the themes that you have quite repeatedly in the book, which is, again, fantastic, is this very clear exposition around how cities evolve. And if nothing else, you understand how complex cities are from your book, but you lay this out in a very clear and easy way. And you organize around different themes, around commercial, around residential, around transportation, infrastructure, open space. But you also provide commentary or observation, I guess, in most of those chapters around inequity, around what were some of the fallouts for all of this amazing growth, investment, vision, that there were communities that were just irrefutably disenfranchised, and usually communities of color and often African-American communities. And I guess I have two questions in that regard. What was it that brought you to that focus of the book? Because there's so many directions you could have taken with this in terms of explaining the history, but as you brought that out. And then what was your thinking in terms of relating either causality or correlation or circumstance, that as you talk about transportation and talk about housing, that we also then lean into zoning and how it aligned with other factors to have perhaps keep Black families disenfranchised in terms of their ability for wealth accumulation, things of that nature. So that's just a light question on.
I think when I looked at, if you look at Oakland prior to Streetcar, okay, so prior to 1890, it's a relatively small city, as most cities were, because people either took horse-drawn omnibuses, which went much slower and couldn't go up hills and down hills, or they walked. And streetcars, electric traction streetcars, just expand the city dramatically. You can go for miles and miles and miles. People can live further. So this is the era when Oakland really expands. It goes all the way out to the borders it has now. Autos just accelerated that. And this is when industry and residents leave downtown, basically, and go out to what are now the suburbs. And when I thought clearly a transportation innovation like the streetcar, and then followed by the automobile, and then followed by the freeway. Those three transportation innovations were incredibly important across the country, right? We're charting where people would live. But then I thought, well, what other factors are really important? And the other factor that was really important was price point, class. Like wealthy people want to live near wealthy people, and they want to live far from industry, and they don't want to live around stores. So they want industry away. They even want stores away. They don't want multiple family units. They want apartment buildings.
Right on to you.
But they love their dogs. They love dogs. That's right.
That was right on to you.
So, and this is something, you see this across the world, right? You go, if you look at cities, right? You look at the history of cities, right? They're wealthy and the not wealthy are always living in separate precincts. However, they used to live really close to each other because servants were rather important. The servants used to, So, and then I said to myself, well, we have something else in this country, not only wealth, but also origin. Whether you originate in Europe, whether you're considered a white person or not. And that varied what white people, in the East Coast, I'm Jewish, Jews were often considered not white, they were excluded a lot because white Anglo-Saxon Protestants felt they were threatened. But across the country, in California and in Oakland, really what determined where people would move and where development would occur and what the development was like, really depended on your skin color and your ethnic origin. Whether you originated in East Asia, then you were excluded a lot from most of the upper income neighborhoods. If you originated in Mexico, you're excluded. And certainly if you originated in Africa, you're excluded. So if you were Black or Latino or Asian, it was another way for the elite, the white elite, to differentiate themselves. And I think that's just a human thing that people like to stand above others. It's one of those pernicious aspects of our species. And so that for me was a huge determinant. If you had to talk about that, if you didn't talk about that, you wouldn't understand where people live. You wouldn't understand why East Oakland looks a lot different than Rockbridge. You wouldn't know, why the commercial districts on, let's say, Foothill Avenue, Boulevard, are a lot different than those on College Avenue or Piedmont Avenue. You wouldn't understand these things. You wouldn't understand why development moves where it moves. And so, and then it was enshrined. It was enshrined in law, right? It was at first. It was pushed by realtors. The NARAB, the National Association of Real Estate Board. They kind of developed this system, but then the federal government got involved, right? And they, what we call redlining now, which, right, basically saying that districts that have mixed race people of different races, buildings of different ages, and buildings of different uses are to be considered very risky for investment, and banks should not consider them. They're considered hazardous for loans. And those encompass most of it. Pretty much all people of color were living in districts like this. And so from the 30s to the 70s and 80s, these districts received very little investment. So you won't understand why they look the way they look, why investment went here, because really it's not just people moving, it's also capital.
Right, no, that's right, that's right. And it's interesting, and I know we're focused on Oakland right now, but just to put much of that in context also, depending on where you were in the nation, there were different legal instruments to affect that outcome. Baltimore essentially established the first race-based zoning, and Richmond really took it to a whole other level. And when I was in Birmingham, we had a map in my office of 1926, and it was a year after the Olmsted brothers had come in to do the park master plan for the city, which they finished while they were out here with Redondo Beach, by the way, in California. But it was a concept of linear parks that would manage flow. It was the kind of design that we're talking about we need to do today. They were doing in 1995. But the connection was going to go across Black and white neighborhoods. City Commission was not going to have that. And then the very next year, they come with zoning. Zoning was just really getting its traction. But they added provisions, and this was really taken from what Richmond and Baltimore and some other cities had done, where the zoning ordinance itself specified who could be where by race. And furthermore, what time of day you could be there. So there was literally a clause in the zoning category that let you know if you were Black or if you're African American or Negro, you had to be out of a certain part of time by a certain day in the land use code. So it's also one of the aspects that they feel was really promulgating, that many historians feel, promulgated the whole strategy of civil rights marches. Because it was sort of a counter-planning response from the community. That then when you walk a certain place you're not supposed to be, that was a significant demonstration of protest. And here in Oakland, it obviously was not that literal in terms of the instrument of land use, but the outcomes were often the same, much the same. Other instruments lent themselves towards that outcome. And as a result, you had social movements and again, a response, a counter response to that kind of determination made by the redlining, by restricted funding, by federal policies, et cetera. But I really thought it was a great thing for you to include that perspective in the book. And then the other side, and I think this might open it up for a little more Q&A with the group. We are also at the point of doing a general plan. And we are a little way into it, but never too late to get a good idea. And what I wanted to, and I guess like our colleague, I'm asking you to lean a little bit into the future as a historian. But based on what you've seen, is there any thoughts or guidance that you would give, or now that I've done this investigation, you guys really might want to think about this. Is there any sort of approach or consideration you might would help either reach, not exacerbate, or somehow ameliorate these conditions that came out of the disparities and the sort of racial totality and so forth around the way the city developed? Is there some approach we might take, or something we might want to look at in terms of correlation? You mentioned the streetcars a moment ago. Some systems we might want to even be very mindful as we approach them. Think about what some of the adverse outcomes might be. What could be some of the positives?
Yeah, I think we need to really think radically, in the sense that, I just got back from the Sierra and I noticed I felt guilty. I'm feeling guilty when I drive recently, when I drive long distances because of what's going on with our climate. And I think we really, so when I say I think we need to think radically, I think Oakland needs to think about adding a couple 100,000 people. A big number, not a small, not a medium number, a big number. And because we're not gonna build our way out, we're not gonna address the housing crisis unless we increase supply dramatically. All types of supply, both affordable supply and market supply. You've got to have market supply. And I think this is, one of the unfruitful debates we have all too often, that you have housing activists who are opposed to market rate housing. And I say to them, well, do you know that 99% of housing built in the country is market rate? So if we're going to opt out of that, we're going to opt, what will we do? Well, it's a little bit, we'll just have a little bit. Yes, we should fight for as much of affordable housing as we can get, no question. And that's how we're doing it. Occasionally you can build all affordable housing developments, but most of the time you're not going to build that many of those. But if you can build 20% affordable, which within each market development, that's going to provide. And you build, not 10,000 but 100,000 units. That's a lot of affordable housing, and that will take pressure off. And I think when getting back to what we were talking about at the earlier, I kind of wish that Oakland, which was mirrored on San Francisco, tried to absorb Oakland and Berkeley and Southern Marin County and Northern San Mateo County and failed. And Oakland then tried to absorb the bits of the East Bay and failed. But I think actually that would have been a good thing. That if we were a borough like Brooklyn, I know it could be raised some tension.
Brooklyn deals with the.
Brooklyn, I think Oakland would have no problem dealing with it. We'd be because I think the biggest problem, and this is again, there are 26 different transportation agencies, as a lot of you know, that don't work together. And the Oakland Airport and San Francisco Airport compete. They don't work together very well. And the water districts are different, and everything is separate. And partly it's due to our topography in the Bay. We have mountains everywhere and water everywhere, and so it resulted in this fragmented nature. But I think we just need to work together as a unified region of close to 8 million people in a much more aggressive way. And it's really hard, because the West Bay has money. It's probably the wealthiest stretch of real estate in the world. If you go from Marin County down to Saratoga, that through San Francisco, it's an unbelievable, stretch of brain power and money. And yet very little of it comes to the East Bay in terms of, occasionally you hear about a gift, to the public school or something to Vallejo or, but not much. So we're living in this very bifurcated socioeconomic region. And I would radically, I think, the whole region needs to build a lot of housing. The whole region needs to build transportation together, not separately. And the whole region needs to think together. And I would love for the Bay Area. I think it's sad that we're probably the most liberal metropolitan area in the country. I think it's fair to say. There's not a Republican within miles. I remember when Contra Costa County was Republican, had Republican congressmen. That's gone. Now I think the closest one is somewhere in the Sierra foothills. Seriously, it's that far to get to a Republican, which is not, but so on one hand, I think like the mayor said, we'd like to think that we're so great because of that. But at the same time, why don't we actually do something incredibly radical and futuristic, as in unifying together, getting out of our gas dependency by building transportation systems that work for everyone, and ending this housing crisis together. I think we can do it. We have the money, we have the brain power, we have the expertise, but there's a kind of selfishness among, a lot of the wealthy people in the Bay Area and others who just don't want us, and so I think it requires really saying to ourselves, and I think as a historian, I can say this, we were talking about this earlier, cities change and they're always changing. We can't hold on to the past. We can preserve what's best of the past. We can try to avoid what's the worst things that we used to do, but we have to move forward. And it's better, rather than being carried forward by the winds of capitalism alone, which is basically what's going on, we can actually proactively, because if you think about it, the mid-century was really, a lot of the book focuses on the period from the end of the war until the 70s. You look at most of the infrastructure and huge developments it's all then. So much was done then. Big plans. And that resulted in the formation of neighborhood groups and citizen activists who opposed big plans. There's been a lot of that. So I understand that. And I've actually, I helped get the DeYoung built. I went to like about 15 community meetings, and and people would go, but it has a tower. And we don't, will you be able to see the tower from all over? And I said, excuse me, since time immemorial, towers are meant to be seen from all over. And then we don't want it. And I said, why? Kuwait Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, those are towers and they're beloved. And they're like, oh. And there's this kind of belief that we can't do big things anymore, that if we do big things, I guess I'm saying we can do smart things.
Yes. Imagine if they've been in Florence in the 1400s.
They would have opposed this, for sure. The people hated the Trans-American Pyramid. Hated.
Yeah. Well, they hated the Eiffel Tower.
They hated the Eiffel Tower.
Right. Okay, and I just want to throw one more thing in the mix, because you mentioned transportation, and you have that great map showing Bart in the region. And it's interesting when you look at the shape and morphology of different transit systems in different cities, and then see how vibrant they are in terms of both access, how many neighborhoods really thrive. And I guess the poster child for everyone's favorite, probably Metro Paris, is one of them. And it's really laid out in this sort of web, like, right, you can really get to any place you need to get to.
With one transit.
We have with one transfer, that's exactly right, 7 a.m. And when you get on the BART, it's wonderful for us for the purpose, like you said, of 2 stops in whatever, we're in San Francisco. But when you think about it in terms of the more local service that it might provide the cities that it moves through, it's really not that kind of system. It is a system to go through places from one to the other, as opposed to really getting into places. So are your thoughts that we might want to see if BART could do a few laterals or?
Yes, I would love, I agree. When you look at BART, you have to say BART was built during the freeway era. So BART is effectively a freeway addition. It's like, and that was really the purpose of BART, to get pressure off to take the cars off of a bridge, get San Francisco and into, but it doesn't get you around the area. And part of one of the saddest legacies of BART was the fact that BART didn't get, most of industry left during the 60s and 70s, went out to Fremont, Hayward, points further. And so the population of Oakland, which had become almost, I think 48% Black in 1980, BART had no provision for getting, BART was finished in 1974. It had no provision for getting the inner city Blacks in Oakland to the jobs in southern Alameda County. Like to have shuttle bus systems from, let's say, Fremont, BART to the auto plants that were part of BART. It was mentioned, and they didn't do it. They didn't care. It was just about getting white collar workers from Orinda to San Francisco, or from the Oakland Hills. So that kind of mentality. So we have to change that mentality. And yes, we need to have, why does, I think I cited this statistic in the book that in Washington, D.C. Metro, which is built a little bit, it's almost the same time as BART, has 36. Oakland has 8, and San Francisco has 8. That's it in the city. So BART was not built as a system to get people around. And yes, it would be amazing to have another line that went through Alameda and then into another part of Oakland, let's say the MacArthur Boulevard corridor, that whole corridor that goes out, that does not have a BART line. It would be great to have that. Yes, to serve all those communities that don't have BART, because it would be great to be able to go from the Richmond district to the Laurel district. with Bart. That would be like Paris. And we really don't need that much, one or two lines would do it.
Yeah,
But they're not thinking that way. They've never thought that way. They've always added on to the ends rather than thought about this.
that's the axis. Okay, so I'm gonna drop this mic and point to that and open it up.
Thank you. So one of the things that frustrates me about this conversation is we've covered history. So now we know what happened in the past and what's kind of like where we are now, like how we got here. And what I've heard over and over and over again, and you just said it again, was they did something or they made a decision. I'd like to open up the conversation for what can we do right now so that they turns into us? Like, what should we be doing to make what you just said happen, rather than this observer role of history? Let's talk about what we can do as a group, as an organization, as a city, and who's doing it and how can we get involved?
I think as an organization, it would be for us to partner up with all the AAA. How many AAAs are there in the Bay Area?
4.
Partner with the 4 AAAs and put forth a position, hold a conference or a position there. How to unify the Bay Area? Because I think unification of the Bay Area and acting collectively is probably the way to get these things done. So maybe that should be the first thing that we should do, is take the AAA, then the city planning directors of like San Jose, Walnut Creek, Oakland, Berkeley, get the planning directors from all the cities together. How do we coordinate finally? Because we have common housing, all the problems that we talk about, and I think housing and transportation are probably the two most prominent discussions. And they involve the environment, obviously.
Right.
They're collective, and we can't approach them piecemeal. I think obviously getting ABAG involved. ABAG was formed through the Bay Area Council. You all know about the Bay Area Council.
What does ABAG stand for?
Association of Bay Area Governments. So ABAG is the metropolitan planning vehicle for the 9 counties. It was formed by the Bay Area Council, which the Bay Area Council was formed in the 50s, and they really pushed towards BART. They were formed by their Southern Pacific Railroad, Bank of America, PG&E. They're the big, and now they changed the complexion, but they're still the big corporations. They formed ABAG and they didn't give it any teeth. So ABAG puts out lots of position papers and ideas, but if you notice, there isn't a whole lot of regional planning. Really the Bay Area Council wanted BART the way it was. So there needs to be some way to figure out how to get the different governmental agencies, municipalities, or nonprofits, et cetera, together with a reformulated ABAG that has teeth. The MTC has more, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission has more teeth than ABAG. They can actually, but I think our regional planning is relatively weak. We have, I think a positive is that there has been some great regional planning, like the East Bay Regional Park District is an amazing organization for the 2 counties. It's done an incredible job. East Bay Mud has done a really great job for the 2 counties. So there's precedent historically for looking at how these, organizations, if there's a way to amalgamate, but transportation has been, and housing have been really hard to get that kind of collective action. So I think that's what we should be doing, is trying to figure out how do we work together to solve the regions, solve them collectively.
And I'm gonna jump in as well, though, Mike, and maybe put a challenge back to us, and this is an AIA hat now. I think about other components across the country, 2 that come to mind for me that step very much in the role of their civic conversation and are there. The BSA in Boston, they have a history of being absolutely proactive. And the whole siting of the Kennedy Library and Museum is largely an outcome of them coming to save the day. In Middle Tennessee, a Nashville-based chapter. Fantastic group, both in terms of addressing design issues in the community, having charrettes and having conversations, but also stepping into the political milieu a bit to have the mayors or the council folks, whoever's running, have at least one conversation about how are you going to build this place. So there is and it is about design. It's sort of what Mayor Schaaf was saying earlier with the Mayor's Institute on city design, but it's taking that model and making it a part of the forum of the political discussion, so that elected officials also understand that their stewardship is as much over how they build the place that they govern, as much as how they manage operations, systems, and politics. So that's something that those AIA components have leaned in very affirmatively to do. And I would imagine we could probably talk to them about how that happens and landmines to avoid, et cetera. But just really bringing it into what we can do today and making it really deep, that's something we might want to explore.
And I would add to that, one of the things that has really struck me, I remember finding out about Telesis. Does anyone remember Telesis? Telesis was a Bay Area regional planning consortium of architects and planners in the 40s. And SF MoMA put on an amazing exhibit. SF MoMA used to do exhibits about urban planning. They don't. There hasn't been one in years. Why not enlist the museums? The Oakland Museum, SF MoMA, they do, the Oakland Museum does exhibits about things that happened, again, historical events, but there's not a lot, like an exhibit about what could Oakland become. I don't remember, what was the last time an Oakland Museum did an exhibit about the city, as a whole, or SF MoMA. They're just not doing it. And those are great for to have. You could have a conference, you could have an exhibition. It's a way to get the idea out. It's a way to get a publication. It's a way to get momentum. It hasn't happened in so long, and that saddens me, because I knew the architecture curators at SF MoMA successively, from Aaron Betsky, to Joe Rosa, and Henry Urbach, and I would talk to them about this, and then Henry does an exhibit about wine countries. And that was his big exhibit. And Aaron did one about icon. And Joe Rosa did one about gourmet. And I was like, this is disgusting. When I said that, gourmet, I mean, we have enough of gourmet and wine country. Why don't we do an exhibit about Bay Area transportation?
Yeah.
Or something like that, or Bay Area, or the underserved housing areas and gentrification and things like that. And the museums just don't do it.
And just to okay. There's a follow-up. There's a follow-up. Wait, there's a follow-up conversation. There's a follow-up conversation happening there. But just again as an example, you put this for me, and not that we always are running to Europe to find our ways to address American urbanism, but I know in the city of Göteborg, Sweden, they have an amazing downtown resource for the community at large, which is essentially a model of the whole city. They have video screens up on the wall. You can do all sorts of little scenario planning of what your city might be. And as they actually build the city and make changes, they change out the model. Once the building is complete, it is replaced. So at any one time, you can go in and get this amazing sense of the place you're living in. And it can also be somewhere where you want to settle an argument and have a conversation. Come on, let's see there. Now you put that kind of house in there, and this is what it's going to be. So having something like that, and that might be digital, I mean, there may be any sorts of ways to connect that kind of tool or resource. And again, we've got this, I hear it's a wonderful state school right up the road that does all kinds of stuff about planning and architecture. We heard about, we went to school, right? Yeah, this is dangerous. You've got two alumni from the same institutions here. This is not a good thing. But it's okay. But I guess the point is that we have resources that we could use in very direct ways, I think, to get some of these questions asked and answered. Mm-hmm. And we just haven't, we haven't leaned in that way.
Museums, universities.
Yeah. Okay, go.
I mean, don't you think though, at the end of the day, so much of the conversation around becoming a region, we're progressive, we're all these things, right? To my mind, we don't have a political champion. Like, who is championing this at a political level? And even when our local politicians step up to a larger place, right? They're not there to support it. And at the end of the day, it takes a leader.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'm just going on 5 minutes here. All that multiple who step other places. There have been groups that are the ones who make the argument, and they give that leader. Maybe someone in their gut knows that this is a place I might want to take it, but there may be two things that are restraining. One may be actually knowing how to articulate the reasons and the wherefores that make the value proposition clear. This is why we should choose this, because it is better for these reasons. And we see ourselves better as an outcome of going in a direction. And then the other is helping to build that sort of support. And everybody, particularly in the kind of concept we're talking about, that's about having folks who are going to be behind. And you know, so you might get a movement going, and someone even in this group we don't even expect right now would step up, and that's who that leader is. Or maybe someone who's already in that environment, who just has been really looking for a coherent argument they can use to lean in more people to start. So I guess what I'm saying, this is sort of getting back to Mike's comment about, you know, we need to own this stuff, know what is coming in real time. And I understand that, but I'm just probably been out here too long to be looking for, you know, somebody over there to walk in and, you know, make it happen. We may need that person, but we probably need to also be as ready as we can for when she or he shows up to have that argument. And again, back to the skill set of what architects do. I mean, cities and regions and people built that swap. Able to give someone that argument in a way that, yeah, you'll be able to stand up against some criticism. And that may be something we're going to talk. Well, I'm sorry.
There's three.
Go ahead. Okay. Oh, she did? Okay, she.
Then
Thank you. I really appreciate the book. I appreciate the conversation. You know, very clearly, we have to talk directly about race and class. Can't talk about why we have not, I believe, have not been at the table to achieve this regional vision of unity without being very specific and clear about that. In your book and others, we've talked about how federal resources in constructing highways have allowed both wealth, individual wealth and industry to move to suburbs and leave behind, you know, poverty and all the urban ills that exist there. And so while we can make this historical claim, and it's so very clear, yet still in the present day, despite how progressive and liberal we are, there are still, for example, my neighbors, nice white couple moved my neighborhood about 2000. You know, it wasn't until like 2018, there's friends from San Francisco would come and visit them because Oakland's scary. And Oakland has always been scary. It's been scary for capital to come and invest. Yeah, I think you wrote in your book the 25 years of no development in Oakland, even though land prices were very cheap. And so, and clearly this is about, you know, a fear of Oakland. When you talked about BART, and so I think about, you know, Berkeley underground at their BART line through the, you know, Mama Howard and civic, you know, activism that caused that to happen. Yet in Oakland, that didn't happen. Despite the fact that Berkeley was a city that used single family housing as a proxy for race-based housing, you know, Baltimore specifically, you know, Berkeley achieved that same thing, but, you know, so many years later, you know, they're able to underground things. Certain suburban parts of Oakland, you talked about towers, you know, I heard the opposition to building the tower on the former California College of Arts and Crafts space to make more affordable housing. I think until we're really able to, you know, address that within our liberal progressive perspective, and very clearly, I don't know how much progress there really will people will have to get, you know, bought into. I have a question. This is quite how many people grew up in Oakland, went to junior high school here? Yeah, excellent. How many people were here prior to 1995? That's a good number. This town has changed dramatically.
1966 here.
Excellent.
Oh, God.
64.
64. I got 64 too. Right. So we've seen so many changes. And so I'll pick up, you know, something that you wrote in your coda to ask this question. It says, in California, in Oakland, where promise of a better future has birthed so many dreams, yet so much follow. We all benefit from digging hella deeper to the place we call home. We're going through a general plan update. As we hella dig deeper, is there any recommendations or suggestions or thoughts you may have about future zoning that we can think about as we go through this process?
What you may have observed. That's sort of what I was trying to.
I mean, this is the, you're real, you know. Like, changes, you know, when my block has 30, my one block has 30 houses. And I think when I moved in, there were about 10 houses were occupied by black families. Now it's about 3. And the white family, but still white families, and it's a very friendly, warm Oakland block. And I hear from a number of the white families who they want to leave Oakland. They don't say exactly why, you know, they will say crime, but they want to get out. They're like, Oakland's going to hell. And it's this attitude, like, so if you were to increase the zoning in, let's say, neighborhoods like Rockridge or Montclair, which should happen, right? You know, Rockridge is the only BART station, if you notice, that doesn't have a planned development. You know, the Coliseum has one, Fruitvale, West Oakland, MacArthur, not Rockridge. It's the only one of the neighborhood stations. You know, it's hard to build a 3-story market hall, and they included housing. The Rockridge is like a great example of like what you're dealing with. So on the one hand, you want to keep the people. You don't want the people from Rockridge all leaving because they have a lot of money and expertise and they love Oakland, but they're skittish. There's no question that there's a white skittishness that I see all the time. I hear all the time. That, you know, that increasing urbanity, making Oakland a more urban place, right? Because I will say to them, I'll say, you know, you should go to East Asia. It's amazing. Go to India. There's people on the streets at all times. It's good. It makes things safe. That's the way to get safety, is to have more people. They look at me in horror because they want to move to like somewhere that's not that urban. So how do you, it's a real question. How do you get people to embrace greater urbanity as opposed to, and at the same time not be freaked out by it? Because I think in a lot of the wealthier parts of Oakland, they're scared of it. And even if they've traveled, you know, I think there's a kind of fear of, you know, I grew up in New York, Queens. Queens is just, you know, dense. I think it's the size of a little bit smaller than Oakland, but it's got, you know, 2 million people. You know, it's just, it's nice. You know, Brooklyn is dense. I mean, but there's a fear in this country, you know, that has driven suburbia, right? And has driven flight. And it has meant people move from, whenever there are problems, you move to the next area, you get away, you move away from your problems, you don't solve them. Yeah. That's a kind of American tradition. We have to kind of, and I see that still happening, sadly, we gotta, I don't know, it's a real question.
And it's interesting, and I don't need to get to our other questions and probably start wrapping up, but to the point you made, and you really were getting into this in your first comment before you put the question together. I think this was Brookings, it was a while ago, actually did a study and asked across race, black and white families, what percentage of people they felt yielded an integrated neighborhood.
Oh yeah.
And it was fascinating for African American families, it was close to 50%, 40%. For most of my families, it was somewhere around 15, 10%. So what happened is that you have this gap between those two thresholds where there's something happening where you know, African American communities feel, okay, this is really integrating, moving more. We've already tipped past the point where many white families now feel, well, no, it's gone beyond it. It's really not an integrated neighborhood anymore. We're out. So before you, it was one of the reasons you saw so much turnover, and this was more, you know, happening in the 80s, 70s, 80s. To some extent, you know, we deal with this now. But one of the challenges we have, and you mentioned zoning, is how do we address zoning in a way that helps us, particularly with our housing crisis? And you know, there's a lot of focus around single family zoning and qualifications it is, what do we need to change? But at the same time, keeping some benchmark that we want housing to be the outcome. So we don't make it so loose and vague that all kinds of speculation starts happening. Because we already see, you know, groups are going to be buying houses and sort of sitting on them to see what might flip. And that can also begin to undermine neighborhoods as well. Depending on the kind of investment that comes in, you begin to assess folks out of being able to keep up with their problem. So it's a complex challenge for sure, but zoning is definitely a key element of that we're going to have to investigate, and it depends on what we want to see as the outcome. We got to make sure that zoning is not going to be a single solution or by itself. We have to make sure that there are other ways we're targeting the kind of development we'd like to see going along. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the book. It answered question. And Jay gets back to your question about political leadership. Bill gets back to your. My concern for Oakland is it does not have an organization that looks at things from 30,000 square feet. The planning department's really doing that with its new downtown plan. So it doesn't have anyone with boots on the ground. And Spur in San Francisco, until about 20 years ago, we used to have both of those, the think tank, but also the boots on the ground, dealing at basically bureaucratic level to implement those changes. I had great hopes for Spur when they moved over here, but they've now become just the think tank and don't have any boots on the ground. So the question is, what can the AIA do? What can the Chamber of Commerce do? What can any civic organization do to have that combination of viewpoints that makes some changes in Oakland? Because it's in dire need of some changes that boots on the ground. Doing pretty well on the upper level. So that is a challenge to you all around here, and for other people to think about what could get an organization like that going, because it's direly needed. I think everyone probably agree with that.
One thing my colleagues here all know about folks who got their kicked out. Those are activist architects who didn't just want to be within the conversations of an RUBC at the conventions, but wanted to get out to communities and actually give them plans, community-informed, community-based. You know, they'd have people doing market analysis all day to say, okay, can we make this happen? And it seems that, again, we talked about BSA a moment ago, if you have a few demonstrations of the organization's value for a community to help get a question asked and answered, or for even the political leadership to say, okay, we pulled together this group of folks who can really think tank how we deal with this issue of concern in this community. That we can start stepping up with a few examples of those that might, also begin to get momentum behind the kind of thing you suggested. But again, I've seen it. It's all over the map. All over the map. You have some components that are really hitting that kind of thing hard. Now others are really more about the convening. And it really is sort of what each of us have stepped up, really to step up.
I'm glad I won't after everyone, because my comment / question was kind of an amalgamation of what everyone said. Started with Mike's question and your response about togetherness. You acknowledged, Mitchell, that the togetherness needs to happen and by the spirit, as well as ills against specific groups. I would offer that what people are leaning towards is that hasn't changed very much. And we don't have leadership that is being collaborative and moving things forward completely. So if it's going to be organizations coming together to influence policy, or could it be policy through integration, meaning every time there is a for-profit, a market rate building built, up the number. So there's a 25% low income that must be in every single building. Could it be that low income housing is in Rockridge, not just in District 7? Could it be that, again, the question is about the subtle integration of, because again, we know race is a construct. It's really only in this country that we talk about gradations of shade and color. It's socioeconomics. It's about how much you have and who you hang out with and how you relate to them. If we're mixing those socioeconomics, is that a more subtle way of getting to where we need to get, where people will look to the right and left and realize we're more the same than not? I really hate that statement, but we're more the same than not. And thank you for the book.
Yeah.
And thank you for the background. Both of you, I respect you both very much. And I've been able to have a personal conversation with both. This is what you want. Vision and
My sense is a lot of the questions, comments that have been made, go beyond Oakland, go beyond urban.
Yes.
They really go to American politics,
Yes.
American political environment, right?
Yes.
Where we have a Republican Party in this country that is increasingly authoritarian,
and anti-democratic and very bent on getting their way. And we have a Democratic Party that has a lot of viewpoints, I think, preserving what we have, putting forth really interesting solutions, but not united in the same way. And that, I think that's one of the central questions for the midterms and for the next presidential election. Is how can, I'll call it the left, put forth an agenda that is compelling and that starts to address the historic inequities of the country and bring people together finally. How do you do that? And if the Democrats can't do it, then who's going to do it, right? And this is I think Biden tries in his own way to do really good things. I think he gets a really bad rap, but he doesn't put forth that new vision. And we talked about having someone in the Bay Area put forth that. What is that new vision? How can it include enough people to be viable and compelling? It would obviously have to be something that we have never had before, which is kind of, scary and exciting at the same time, right?
But one thing, if I may, because this is fascinating conversation, you take it to say. And I think about your comment, you actually would make me think about James Baldwin for a minute when you were opening up with your discussion in email. And I would certainly commend anyone to watch on YouTube, if you can, his debate between Berkeley in 1965 at Cambridge University on the question of race. It is absolutely brilliant. And I put that transcription up, but the only other thing coming close is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And it's just absolutely brilliant, Baldwin's apologia in that exchange. But it also made me think about the civil rights movement in general. And when you think about movements around change, often we do think it was only a Martin or a Ralph who made that happen. Oh, no. I mean, there were rooms full of people like this whose names you are never going to know, who were also pushing what needed to be pushed in order for those folks to be able to stand up and do their thing. So all that is to say that it is going to have to be groups of people, some of whom may never, get the spotlight, and many didn't want it, but they knew they had common cause around trying to get a change going. And I'm not even saying that it's just going to be around that issue of race, although it is fundamental. This is the Baldwin's closeout on that argument. But in terms of even the smarter choices we make about how we build, that there needs to be, again, the argument around improved transportation that really gets deeper into the neighborhoods that help us sustain the kind of footprint and the ability to provide housing and access to transportation. All these things need champions. And it's not going to be us just sort of waiting for someone to step out and, oh, that's the one I'll go run behind. This is a room of some very informed individuals. And again, you all know a lot of what people who are informed as well. So it really is about having some commitment on the time, looking at what some of the prospects might be, and then calling up the planning director and say, why aren't you doing this? What's wrong with you? Wait for years for you to get this going. And if it makes a whole lot of sense, we welcome. That's the kind of support and push that we all need.
Mr. You're gonna final words before I.
Yeah, bring us home, man.
As a historian, and when we bring up all these issues, unfortunately, I always look at, the formation of American mentalities, and it's deep. The white mentality that fears urbanity, fears people who are different, it's deep. It's ingrained. It's ingrained with what the violence they did to those people. Part of it, that 4 centuries of incredible violence against Native peoples and Black peoples and others. It's going to be really hard as we see, to change that. Or to communicate with them on a kind of level that you can work together. Because it's almost like there's a psychoanalysis needs to be taken for the whole country. How do you do that? I think there's been I think we try.
James all said that, yeah.
I think so. We try to do that, but we have to do it. I think the place to start is like Rockridge, places like that. Like we talk to the liberals and convince them, like.
Barbara's back.
Barbara,
I do want to just, because 2 practical things that I think are happening.
Right.
So there is a lot of stuff we will be integral and involved in that, but really the plan is the really more imminent plan that will be approved by the city council this fall. And inclusionary zoning is something that's going to be considered by the council for developers to consider in terms of their height limitations, height increases. And this is an interesting time to have this conversation because I don't think we're heading directly into a peak of development, but who knows? So I do think there's opportunities to weigh in about density and I don't think many of us in our community that with Bill for the last 3 years on this don't think it's dense enough to your point about and then also the balance between you know what our retail what our commercial world will look like and our residential world will look like downtown. Obviously it's a conversation we have to have again. And then relative to I live in Rockridge and there is a whole community of YIMBYs in Rockridge that actually we just voted in a slate in RCPC, which is the body that jammed up the project that you were talking about earlier with Market Hall years ago. Well, it's actually jammed up the ice cream people before that. Dryers. But there is a whole contingent of people in Rockridge that actually are trying to get more infill development in sort of the Scott Wiener mentality of how you actually get infill enough in these areas. So I wouldn't say there's not a lot of hope, but I think it really requires people to speak up. Like if you don't speak up, you shouldn't speak up. Yeah, you really have to speak up.
That even to build AI that help develop things, be the developer. So you can control what you want, where you want kind of thing. Why isn't there some place that kind of decides what's going to go there and already has all the approval parameters that you want to see?
We lost, Jerry Brown killed redevelopment.
Yeah, he's still saying it.
Well, can it come back? I mean, now that we're wiser and know whatever.
I mean, it's in a lot of.
One thing I know we need to wrap it up. I did want to offer up as a good friend Barbara is an example of that. And this effectively has been this way. Two organizations have come together to have this forum, this discussion, to talk about design, not just as a physical manifestation, but as something that is the result of politics, of the social moment, of infrastructure, of so many elements that come through these kind of decisions that we make through our political and social processes. Just that recognition alone, bring this into a forum around design and development and interest. This is also some reason for us to feel good. So I want to thank you all for doing this.
I just want to thank my co-chairs of the Regional and Urban Design Forum, Brian Schwarzer, who's here, and putting this. And then of course our Mayor Schaaf, Planning and Building Director William Gilchrist,